Plan on transferring into a selective high school in years 8 to 11, chances are you will have to complete a HAST exam. As someone who's completed it multiple times and with really good success, and have taught other students to actually do quite well in this exam as well, I know a thing or two on how to maximize your chances. Let's get into it. The HAST exam stands for the Higher Ability Selection Test, and it's created and assessed by a company called ACER, which typically makes formal assessments for different types of events. In this instance, they use the HAST exam to determine the academic performance and level of a student at a point in time. This exam has 4 key components. Number 1, mathematical reasoning, which is maths. Number 2, reading comprehension. Number 3, abstract reasoning, which is quite similar to general ability. And number 4, it's written expression, which essentially means a writing task that needs to be completed. This is quite beneficial for students who may not come from a really well-off background, because for these selective high schools, they are completely free to actually get in. For this exam though, it does have a small cost, but the cost benefits of actually getting in far outweighs the cost because of the benefits that you get in year 12 when you do the HSC exam. So the logic behind this is, if you are in a good high school, you do the HSC exam, your internal school mark as well as the school assessment mark will actually be dragged up because the other students in your grade are performing well. But if you go to a local high school, which may not be a selective or even a private school, and their ranking's quite low, chances are they could actually make your mark go lower, which ultimately makes it more difficult for you to go into university and study the course that you actually want to study. Saying that though, selective secondary high schools as well as some independent high schools use the HAST exam to determine which students can gain entry into their school. It is not the only criteria that they're looking for, but it is the primary driver and determining factor that they use to determine which students can get in, because it helps them know the academic performance of each student. So for context, I've mentioned this in other videos before, but just to reiterate again, I got into Penrith High School in year 6, moving into year 7, and I tried 3 times to get into Girraween High School, and in year 10, I did the exam, made it in, and so in year 11 and 12, I was in Girraween High School. In my opinion, the HAST exam is not the most difficult exam in terms of its format, but it is the most competitive exam. So in terms of the likelihood of people getting in, it is extremely hard because there's not many spots available. This makes it a little bit easier in the latter years, where sometimes in certain schools, like Girraween for instance, they have additional spots available for a particular grade, so that it's more chances for students to actually get in. Typically, when students are going for that grade though, more students are actually going for it, so it does kind of even out. But let's think about it like this. If you are in Penrith High School and you want to move to Girraween High School, if Girraween High School has some additional spots available and I move from Penrith to Girraween, then there'll also be a vacancy in Penrith as well, since I've just left Penrith. So you have to factor that in. There are currently 11 selective high schools that currently use the HAST exam for students that are looking to transfer into a selective high school. In terms of the schools, I'll just be listing them down. They are Baulkham Hills High School, Girraween High School, Coringa High School, Fort Street High School. In terms of their year 11 exam, Gosford High School, Hornsby Girls High School, Helston Agricultural High School, Northern Beaches Secondary College Manly Campus, North Sydney Girls High School, Penrith High School, and St. George Girls High School. I'll make sure to have it up on the screen here as well for your reference, because it is important to know which schools require a HAST exam and which schools do not require it. In terms of the process of actually getting in, every school will vary slightly in terms of the application process to transfer into the selective high school. Although the schools that I've mentioned previously, the 11 schools, will require a HAST exam. Although in saying that though, there are other selective high schools out there that do not require it or have a different exam altogether. Students cannot automatically transfer from a semi-selective or partially selective high school or a fully selective high school into another selective high school just because they are in the ecosystem. Instead, what they have to do is they have to go through the entire process again through the application. In my opinion though, it is beneficial if you're already in a partially selective high school or in a selective high school, just because when I moved into Gurween High School, wasn't the only person from Penrith High School to move in. I moved in with 4 to 6 different other students, so we kind of moved as a bit of a pack. And I wouldn't say that's the only differentiating factor, but I would say it's beneficial. So just keep that in mind. Additionally as well, in terms of if you are applying for multiple selective high schools, you will have to do an individual application for each one. I believe at this point in time, you can apply up to 2 selective high schools at the same time in terms of transferring. So if you wanted to move into Penrith and Gurween High School, separate applications have to be done for both, where you have to supply copies of the different information that they both require. Let's use Gurween High School as an example, just because I'm quite familiar with that process. So obviously you have to do the HAST exam, but they'll also require some academic achievements. So anything that you've done in terms of the academic point of view, any achievements that you've done, I think that would be fantastic to include. Some extracurricular participation that you've done. So if you're part of the chess club, any sporting clubs, any art clubs or art societies that you've been doing, definitely try to include that as well. Require your past 2 NAPLAN reports, as well as they will want the last 2 years of your school reports. Like I said, if they do have the HAST exam, they put more weighting in terms of that, although they won't tell you it's basically right. Where I've spoken to people who have better reports than me, or people who don't have better reports than me, but if they have a really good score in terms of the HAST exam, they make it in. In terms of the application fee, it will be approximately $60, but for each school, they'll also require that fee as well. So Penrith might be $50, Gurween $60. This is not refundable either, so keep this in mind if you are applying for multiple schools, but I think the cost of not applying at all is even worse than just paying the fee. The experience that you gain when you complete this exam, as well as go through the application process, is so beneficial for you leading up to the HSC in Year 12. So just give it a go, even if you're kind of on the fence on that. It'll also require you to submit some proof of residence, as well as making sure that you were born here in Australia. So just keep that in mind. I may create a part 2 of this video focusing on the supporting documentation, just because if you think that you can just supply the bare minimum, you are in a rude awakening. So I can break down exactly how you can maximize your chances from the supporting documentation side of things, only if there's enough interest. So if you are interested in this, make sure to let me know down in the comments below, just because these types of videos require so much research compared to some of the other breakdowns. So definitely do let me know. In terms of the difficulty of the actual exam though, in my opinion, the HAST exam is designed to measure the academic ability rather than academic achievement. So just like in the New South Wales selective exam in Year 6, which is done by Cambridge Assessment, I believe that that test is actually a little bit harder than what the HAST exam is. Only reason why is because the HAST exam is a little bit more predictable. In saying that though, the Cambridge Assessment exam is done in Year 6, while the HAST exam is done in 7, 8, 9, 10. So that's the difference there. So obviously, if you put the questions side by side, the HAST exam will be more difficult, but the format of the actual exam itself, I believe the Cambridge Assessment one in Year 6 is actually harder at this point in time. Obviously, the content does scale with the grade level. So if you compare with Year 7, Year 6, then there would be similarities in terms of the difficulty. But once you hit into Year 8, 9, and 10, obviously the HAST exam is going to be more difficult, just because the selective exam from Cambridge Assessment is only done in Year 6. These tests are multiple choice, so make sure you circle the bubble correctly for each corresponding question, and you don't leave any question unanswered, or if you fill in 2 questions at once, because they are machine marked. Essentially, a machine will just process all the test forms, and if you circle it incorrectly or if you circle it correctly, then it'll just mark it through there. So it's not done by humans, it's actually done by machines, so just keep that in mind. In terms of the writing exam, this is done by humans, so it is assessed by 2 separate markers. And the benefit of this is that if I think that a writing task is worth 13 and the other person marking it is thinking that it's worth 18, that's a big enough discrepancy. So if there is a big discrepancy between those 2 marks, it will be based on the supervisor's mark, who will make a final determination as they have even more experience in doing that. If I mark a 13 and the other marker gives a 15, there's not a large discrepancy between those 2, so we might get an average, so a 14. And this is the exact same process which is done in Year 12 as well, where there'll be 2 separate markers that we're marking basically all the English exams, just to make sure that we are as reliable and accurate as possible. What is interesting though is that for the HAST exam, you are not given a mark out of 30 or 25. Instead, for each of the subjects, you will see where the student or child stacked up compared to the other applicants in that year group who has also completed that exam. So for reading comprehension, you'll get like a bit of a bar, and it'll tell you the top ranking students, the middle ranking students, and the bottom ranking students, and it will also tell you where you placed as well. Obviously, you want to be as high as possible in each of those. And if you are quite high in all of them, then obviously it maximizes your chances of actually trying to get in. If you know that in certain sections that you're really low or in the middle, that's something for you to keep in mind in future years when you're also trying to transfer again if you were not successful the first time around. As the report that you receive does not give the actual score, it is a little bit more generalized in that instance because you don't know how many questions you got wrong. You may only have gotten 3 questions wrong, but if everyone else in the exam only got 2 questions wrong, you'll be at the very bottom of that graph or the column that they kind of give you. So it's not necessarily you're performing poorly, but compared to the other students, not just at the center, but for everyone who's completed the HAST exam across those 11 schools. The school also has access to the raw mark. However, they will not give this to students for obvious reasons. Same thing in Year 6. They also have the mark that they've given in terms of the internal score mark, but this is scaled accordingly, so they're not allowed to give it to students. Interesting information is that when I did the HAST exam in Year 9, in terms of that column graph that I got, in terms of how I performed compared to other students in that grade, I performed a lot better than when I got and did the exam in Year 10. However, like I said before, it depends on the number of spots available at that school, if they can even offer it. So even though I got a better score in the HAST exam in Year 9, and I got a lower score in Year 10, since there were more spots available in Year 10, I still got in that regard. So there is a strategy to it, because if you're applying for schools that are really, really high and your level's not very good, then there's no point. I would think about that with your tutor, so liaise with them, because they can help guide you in the right direction if they do have experience in this area. Not many people have experience doing the HAST exam, but if you do find a tutor who has experience in doing this, then definitely try to ask them the right questions to assist your child. In terms of preparation, there are a few strategies that I would suggest. This is the last section of this video, but it's arguably the most important. The first thing that you have to consider is you have to work closely with your tutor. I stress this because if you have a really good tutor, they can help guide you in what you have to do in terms of approaching this exam. The HAST exam does have a pattern in terms of the questions that they typically provide. It is somewhat predictable compared to the Cambridge assessment test, which was a little bit tricky at the beginning, but it's a lot harder to predict because of the depth of questions. For the HAST exam, there's less in depth, I suppose, and there's fewer types of questions that they typically ask, so it's easier for us to prepare in advance. So work with your tutor and they can help you accordingly. When I was younger, I unfortunately had to do trial and error, as there was no tutor at that point in time that had experience in doing HAST exams. I know that we do this here at Bing's Academy, but not many other places do it. Definitely try to research as much as you can, as there may be more places that will be focusing on this area. I know group tutoring places probably won't be a fit here. The reason why is because there's such fewer spots available. It's a lot more competitive, and typically group tutoring, they want more students getting into the top schools, and they only want to highlight that as opposed to maybe one-on-one tutors. In saying that though, some one-on-one tutors may still be a great fit, even if they haven't done the test themselves, because like I said, it's somewhat predictable in terms of some of the questions that are assessed. You just have to make sure they do have some experience in breaking down some of those topics for your child to have the best chance possible. Some of my best tutors are actually people who haven't gone through the selective process or through the HAST exam, but since they have such a great ability breaking down concepts that are commonly seen in the HAST exam, they could be the best fit. So obviously do your due diligence and make sure you research accordingly. Secondly, in terms of preparation, what you do need to consider is you have to be mindful of the time. If you don't have much experience in doing these questions in a time setting, that is the biggest thing that you have to keep in mind, as the questions are not necessarily difficult. With enough time, I think every student can get a really high score in it, but there's not much time allocated for each question, and it's very easy for you to spend more time on certain questions. Just like in all exams, keep an eye out on the clock so that you're not spending too much time on certain questions, or if you're spending a little bit quick on certain questions as well, then it allows you more time to spend on other questions that you may not have spent enough time on as well. Lastly, make sure you learn concepts before you do any practice or any practice papers as well. I have parents time and time again get their children to do a bunch of practice papers that are available online. However, if they keep making the same mistakes over and over again, then you'll just make a habit of making the same mistake over and over again. This is not the way you want to do things. Instead, you want to learn the concepts first, and if you know the concepts, then you can do practice in terms of the practice paper, so that you can actually make sure you have the right approach and you have the right habits in terms of answering these questions, not the other way around. It's a very flawed approach, and I would only suggest you to only go into practice papers only after you know the concepts, or if you have a very little amount of time up to the exam. So the exam is next week, you haven't done any preparation, you don't have time to learn the concepts, it's probably better to familiarize yourself with the test format by going through the practice papers only in that instance. But ideally, you don't leave it up until you only have a week or a month to actually do this HAST exam as well. The writing though is the most predictable in terms of the HAST exam, so that's something a tutor might be able to assist. So in conclusion, the HAST exam is a fundamental component for students that are looking to transfer into one of the higher selective high schools here in New South Wales. I've gone over the application process, why this exam exists, what schools actually require this exam, some tips and tricks, and as well as what you can do in terms of your preparation leading up to the HAST exam as well, and when you actually complete the exam. If you want a part 2 of this video where I go through the supporting documentation in terms of the application and more of the strategy side of things, do let me know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to thumbs up, subscribe, and let me know as well, and I'll be more than happy to provide. Okay, thank you guys. Bye.